Music and laughter can be smothered in a silence more chilling than any scream. Rome in the Renaissance, the year 1502. Within the gilded rooms of the Vatican, a wedding banquet rose to a fever of luxury. Roasted peacocks shimmered beneath sheets of gold leaf, goblets overflowed with spiced wine, and the very air was thick with rose water and the scent of authority. This was not a simple marriage. It was theater, negotiation, and before sunrise, it would give birth to a spectacle so obscene that later ages would speak of it only in hushed tones. That night, the ritual of the body was enacted not a single time, but 3 times as witnesses looked on. The phrase history pinned to this shadowed chapter is stark. 3 times that night while they all watched. At the heart of the display stood a bride, wrapped in silks. Only 22, yet already hardened by the brutal stagecraft of Renaissance power. She was the daughter of Pope Alexander V, ruler of Christendom, and the most notorious pontiff of his time, and the sister of Cesare Borgia, whose relentless hunger washed Italy in blood. The name Borgia signified more than riches and rank. It meant venom, scandal, and dread. Friends were purchased, enemies were erased, and kinship itself became small change passed from hand to hand. For Lucrezia, marriage had never been romance. It had always been calculation. On this night, even her body would be turned into a ledger, her intimacy into evidence, her degradation into political security. The Vatican hall swelled with nobles, envoys, and cardinals, each mind measuring how this bond might shape their chance to endure. Her groom, Alonso d'Este, heir to the old Duchy of Ferrara, sat beside her. His house was ancient, proud, and wary of the Borgias. For centuries, the Este had ruled with the gravity of tradition, while the Borgias were treated as perilous upstarts, a Spanish clan that clawed upward to papal command through graft and disgrace. The Este family did not accept their new pact with easy trust. They wanted more than ceremony, more than pledges. They insisted on certainty, and in this world, certainty meant consummation. It was insufficient that the vows had been spoken beneath gilded arches, insufficient that treaties were signed and sealed by papal might. Alonso's kin dreaded gossip, whispers that might later stain his vigor or Lucrezia's capacity for children. They remembered her earlier unions, each one drowned in shame or blood. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had been discarded under the most humiliating charge of all, impotence, a likely fabrication engineered by her own house to release her for another match, yet one that chained her name to scandal forever. Her second husband, Alonso of Aragon, a man she was said to have loved, was butchered on the Vatican steps, stabbed and strangled in murder widely laid at Cesare's feet. These phantoms clung to Lucrezia as she crossed into this third marriage. The Este clan refused to be the next sacrifice on the altar of Borgia designs, so they issued a demand that stripped away the last pretense of tenderness or honor. The marriage bed must not only be used, it must be seen. When the feast dimmed, when poets ran out of lines and dancers spent their final turns, the pair were guided not to a secluded room, but to a prepared stage. Curtains were parted just enough for chosen observers, papal clerics, Este and envoys, and notaries to look in. These men stood with forced gravity, faces slightly turned, yet eyes fixed, noting each movement, each breath, each mark of potency and fertility. In the wavering light of candles, the bride became nothing but her most functional purpose, a living guarantee. The air could only have been suffocating. Picture the hush in the chamber, broken by the crackle of torches, the whisper of fabric, and the coerced closeness of 2 young people turned into performers in a grotesque drama. Alonso, heir of Ferrara, would have felt his pride forced into chains by the requirement to prove himself before strangers. Lucrezia, already robbed of 2 marriages by annulment and murder, would have felt her very spirit stamped as property, whittled down to flesh and proof. Every motion served as contract, every gasp was notarized, every detail was stored for later testimony. Yet here lies the part that history rarely breathes aloud. It was not performed once. It was repeated 3 times. The first act wiped away doubt. The second smothered rumor. The third locked the alliance beyond contest. Each time the watchers held their stations, eyes cold as tempered steel, their pens and tongues ready to swear to what they had witnessed. 3 times that night while they all watched, her bride's body became a document, her privacy sliced open, and her humanity traded away in the service of power. What does it mean for a woman to be used with such pitiless disregard? What does it mean for a family to turn their own daughter into a public spectacle of disgrace? Renaissance Italy was no fairy tale of romance or chivalry. It was a den of serpents where shifting alliances ruled, where city-states like Venice, Milan, and Naples plotted for supremacy, and where the papacy itself, meant to shepherd souls, became the most relentless player of all. Pope Alexander VI wielded his children like chess pieces, marrying them off and discarding them as alliances rose and fell. Cesare Borgia, Lucretia's brother, cut a crimson trail through Italy. His cruelty was renowned, his hunger for power unchecked. To them, Lucretia was not truly a daughter or a sister. She was a medium of exchange. Yet humiliation can ignite into something different. Did she cry that night? Did her vision swim with shame as the witnesses leaned closer to mark her every movement? Or had she already learned the lesson drilled into her from birth, that even degradation could be shaped into a weapon? The whispers began almost at once. The Este envoys carried the account back to Ferrara. Noble circles in Venice and Florence retold it over cups of wine. Clerics in Rome muttered about a theater of flesh staged with Vatican approval. What had been intended as proof turned to rumor, and what had been meant as disgrace hardened into legend. Everyone knew now. Alonso d'Este was virile. Lucretia was fertile. There could be no annulment, no talk of impotence, no opening to unravel the union. The alliance was written into the body. The small scenes of that night remain haunting. A notary lifting his quill, narrowing his eyes through wavering candlelight. A cleric clutching a rosary, murmuring private prayers while his gaze betrayed his piety. An Este envoy shifting in discomfort, trapped between duty and disgust. And beyond them all, Lucretia, the bride whose life had been bargained away more times than she could remember, lying under the scrutiny of men who saw not a person, but proof. A body turned into the ink of a contract. Here is where the record bends. In that same act of being shamed, the young woman gained something no one had expected to leverage.
For once, the evidence could not be twisted against her. She had done what was required in a way no one could deny. No rumor could dissolve this marriage. No fabrication could erase sworn testimony. The grotesque pageant that stripped her dignity also equipped her with legitimacy. In Ferrara, legitimacy kept one alive. This was the paradox of Renaissance Italy. The same world that forged weapons out of shame could also hammer power out of it. What was designed to imprison her became the base of her authority. What was meant to degrade her hardened into the armor she would wield in later years. That first night in Ferrara was not a simple consummation. It was political drama written on human flesh, a grim covenant sealed by candlelight. In that theater, Lucrezia Borgia absorbed the harshest lesson of her life. After that night in 1502, when Lucrezia Borgia's body was made into proof and her dignity into a public tableau, the refrain of 3 times that night washed across Italy. Yet what at first appeared to be her ultimate abasement became the crucible that remade her. From pawn to duchess, from scandal to endurance, Lucretia reshaped the theater of her humiliation into the stage of her authority. In Ferrara, the memory of that grotesque consummation followed her like a trailing shadow. The Este family, ancient and proud, had secured what they demanded: certainty. Their heir had shown his potency, and Lucrezia her fertility. No annulment could sever the bond. No rumor of impotence could poison it. Even so, while Ferrara's nobles looked down on the woman they regarded as a stained bourgeon, Lucrezia honed an unexpected blade: resilience. In the weeks after she arrived, the court's murmurs grew barbed. Some women giggled behind fans, christening her the bride of the stage. Men drank and retold the triple act, layering on flourishes as wine untied their tongues. Clerics who had been present hinted at select details in guarded gossip. For most women of that era, such infamy would have been a cell with no key, but Lucrezia grasped a truth her enemies failed to see. Once shame is dragged fully into daylight, it cannot be weaponized in the same way again. What they believed would break her instead released her grip on fear. Her approach was quiet at first. She did not fight the rumors. She allowed them to circle, knowing that resistance would feed them. Instead, she began to weave a new narrative around herself. She charmed the Ferrara court with wit, composure, and a poise so disarming that scandal lost its edge. Visitors who arrived expecting a notorious daughter of a pope departed surprised by her grace. Bit by bit, her standing altered, not erased but reshaped. She became not the captive of disgrace, but the woman who carried it without flinching. And poise in politics converts into influence. What does it mean for a woman to be used with such merciless intent? What does it mean for a family to turn their daughter into a public pageant of disgrace? Renaissance Italy was not an era of romance or gallant honor. It was a nest of vipers where shifting pacts ruled, where city-states like Venice, Milan, and Naples schemed for advantage, and where the papacy itself, meant to guide souls, acted as the most ruthless player of all. Pope Alexander VI moved his children like pieces on a board, marrying them off and casting them aside as alliances rose and fell. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, carved a blood-stained route across Italy. His cruelty was notorious, his drive unchecked. To such a family, Lucrezia was not truly a daughter or a sister. She was tendered like currency.
Yet disgrace can harden into something else. Did she weep that night? Did her eyes swim with shame as witnesses leaned forward to note her every motion? Or had she long since absorbed the lesson taught from her first breath, that in this world even degradation could be fashioned into a weapon? The murmurs began almost immediately. The EST envoys carried the tale back to Ferrara. Nobles in Venice and Florence retold it over wine. Clerics in Rome murmured about a theater of flesh staged under Vatican sanction. What had been intended as proof turned into gossip, and what had been meant as humiliation became legend. Everyone now understood. Alonso de Este was potent. Lucrezia was fertile. There would be no annulment, no whisper of impotence, no path to undo the union. The alliance had been stamped into living flesh. The tiny scenes of that night remained unsettling. A notary shifting his quill as he peered through candlelight. A cleric gripping his rosary, whispering private prayers while his eyes betrayed his piety. An EST envoy moving uneasily, caught between obligation and revulsion. And beyond them all, Lucrezia, the bride whose life had been bargained more times than she could count, lying beneath the gaze of men who did not see a woman, but proof, a body turned into the ink of a contract. Here, the record twists. In the very act of being shamed, the young woman gained what few expected: power. For once, the evidence could not be turned against her. She had fulfilled her role in a way that no one could dispute. No rumor could unmake the marriage. No lie could erase sworn testimony. The grotesque right that stripped her dignity also armed her with legitimacy. In Ferrara, legitimacy meant survival. This was the paradox of Renaissance Italy. The same world that wielded shame as a bludgeon could forge strength out of it. What had been designed to cage her became the foundation of her authority. What was meant to humiliate her hardened into armor she would carry in the years ahead. That first night in Ferrara was not a simple consummation. It was a political drama performed with living bodies, a grim covenant sealed by candlelight. Within that theater, Lucrezia Borgia absorbed the harshest lesson of her life. Ferrara's people, too, learned to regard her differently. While the Estonals clung to their suspicions, ordinary citizens began to notice the young duchess's devotion. She moved among them, distributing arms, attending religious festivals, and speaking with a tenderness that contradicted the Borgia name. Mothers whispered that she smiled at their children. Priests murmured that she knelt in prayer longer than many of her peers. It did not take long
before she was no longer the Borgia bride. She became la buona duchessa, the good duchess. Yet this change did not rest on charm alone. It was forged within the brutal schooling of her family's world. Lucrezia understood the stagecraft of politics as well as anyone. She had watched her brother, Cesare, wield armies and assassinations to cut his road through Italy. She had watched her father, Pope Alexander VI, use matches like blades, discarding men the instant they lost their usefulness. She knew that survival depended not only on appearances, but on command of the script. So, she built a new stage in Ferrara. Literaturists established salons, glittering gatherings where poets, philosophers, and scholars argued under her patronage. She filled halls with dialogues on Plato, recitations of Ariosto, and the music of court composers. In those rooms, the whispers of scandal thinned into the echoes of intellectual brilliance. Guests who arrived curious about the infamous bride departed speaking of her refinement, her keen mind, and her generosity toward the arts. Slowly, she replaced the memory of 3 humiliating nights with the image of a duchess who lifted Ferrara into a beacon of Renaissance culture. Culture in that Italy was more than beauty. It was influence. Patronage could cleanse reputations, reshape legacies, and rewrite the stories traded across courts. As her father had bought loyalty with coin and her brother with fear, Lucrezia purchased hers with art, music, and grace. She turned the very eyes that once stared through parted curtains into witnesses of a new performance, one she directed.
Her political sense grew sharper year by year. When Alonso left for war, it was Lucrezia who ruled Ferrara in his absence. She issued decrees, managed accounts, and bargained with envoys. Citizens who had doubted her began to whisper about her fairness. Nobles who had mocked her origins started to concede her skill. Even Alonso, once driven to prove his marriage 3 times beneath scrutiny, came to rely on her counsel. She ceased to be merely his wife. She became his partner in power. Perhaps her greatest strength flowed from the very weapon used against her, her body. In a world where a woman's value was bound to fertility, the creature's public consummation erased doubt forever. She bore children, fortifying the estate line, and each birth tightened her position. No one could challenge her legitimacy. No one could propose an alternative. Her humiliation had sealed her throne. Did she ever forget the faces of those who watched her that night? Did she recall the notaries with ink-stained fingers, the clerics wrapped in forced solemnity, the envoys shifting in the candlelit gloom? Perhaps she did. Perhaps she carried those images as scars. Or perhaps she fed on them, reminding herself with every decree she signed, every court she impressed, every festival she hosted, that the eyes which once tried to shame her had become unwilling witnesses to her triumph. Still, the enigma will not lie still. Scholars dispute without end. Was Lucrezia only a survivor, molded by the brutality of men? Or was she a calculating force who learned to convert every humiliation into leverage? Some point to her letters, cautious and measured, and claim they reveal a woman always performing, always scripting her image. Others insist they show a woman trapped by circumstance, enduring but never free. The truth likely sits between. She was both victim and strategist, both pawn and player. What cannot be denied is the change. The young woman who entered Ferrara under a weight of disgrace left a legacy of authority. The court that mocked her learned to respect her. The people who gossiped about scandal came to revere her as their good duchess. The act devised to strip her dignity instead fixed her claim. Yet the question that chills refuses to fade. Why did it have to happen 3 times? Was it paranoia? Was it cruelty? Or was it the twisted emblem of her world? A world where flesh served as proof, where marriage resembled war disguised as love, and where a woman's body became a battlefield for alliances. The 3 repetitions were not simple excess. They embodied Renaissance politics, ruthless, shaming, and inescapable. Centuries later, the echo of that night persists. It is a tale that will not be buried because it forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Power has always demanded sacrifice, and too often the offering is the body of the powerless. Lucrezia's humiliation was not singular. Countless women across ages have been bargained, displayed, and stripped of dignity to serve ambition. Her story endures because she achieved what so few could. She transmuted humiliation into strength. That is why 3 times that night still sends a chill. It reminds us that power and shame are frequently 2 sides of the same coin. It forces us to ask, how many lives, how many bodies, how many intimate disgraces have been turned into proof for someone else's rise? In that flickering candlelight, we glimpse not only Renaissance Rome, but the shadow of a truth that has not vanished. The curtain may have fallen on Lucrezia Borgia's stage, yet its reverberations remain. History expected her to be crushed. Instead, she became untouchable. Perhaps that is the final irony of her tale. The very act meant to unmake her gave her the immovable armor of legitimacy. The bed intended to confine her became the base of her throne, and the eyes that once watched in silence became unwilling witnesses to her